Hey, welcome to e-flux, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to have as our guest Stephen Van Trees, who flew here from Washington D.C. today, and Boris Groys in conversation afterwards as the closing event for the exhibition we have downstairs now on the second floor, Specters of Communism, which is closing on Saturday, on March 28th. So make sure you find a chance to see the exhibition before it closes. The exhibition is curated by, of course, Boris Groys. So Stephen is well, both an aeronautic engineer and also an ex-Slavic studies student who is now working on a translation of the complete 3-volume works of Nikolai Fedorov. Now, Nikolai Fedorov is someone who is not known as well as he should be, and in a way, Stephen's lecture will be about how influential his thinking really was, both historically, but then also in terms of its scope and relevance today. He's a really special figure. Who is actually familiar with Fedorov and Russian Cosmism? Okay. Who is curious about Fedorov and Russian Cosmism? Okay, so this is this is a very timely lecture then. I mean, Fedorov he's someone who I guess, I mean, we first came across through Boris's writings, and then really started to become an object of fascination when Anton and I made a kind of pilgrimage to visit the Kabakovs, Ilya and Emilia Kabakov in far east Long Island, maybe like 2 years ago or so, 2.5 years ago. And Ilya Kabakov started to introduce us to this kind of strange, what Boris calls a kind of metaphysical materialist philosophy that emerged mainly from Nikolai Fedorov around the late 19th century and influenced a lot of the thinkers in late 19th, early 20th century, before the Russian Revolution, during and after, which has elements of religion, has elements of science fiction, and is a kind of strange mashup between Enlightenment thinking, DIY rocket science through figures like Tsiolkovsky, and a kind of humanist religion, right? So one of the characteristic one of the characteristic lines of thinking that Fedorov had was he wanted to work towards the resuscitation of all of the humans who ever lived and died through how do you conquer death in this way? You do it by conquering heaven, right? But heaven and space are understood to be a kind of unity. There's no difference between heaven and space. So if you want to conquer death, you have to first colonize heaven. To colonize heaven, you have to actually inhabit space, right? And how do you inhabit space? Through spaceflight, through engineering, right? So this is just a really quick introduction, and Stephen will give you the full story, I think. Just to give you a bit of background on our speakers tonight, Stephen Van Trees translated the complete text of the first 2 volumes of the Philosophy of the Common Task from 2000 to 2009, and he's working now on the 3rd volume. It's interesting. I think the Common Task first only appeared because Fedorov never published in his lifetime, so it only appeared in Russian in
1905.
1905.
First revolution.
The 3 volumes appeared in 1982 or something. 95. My God. Van Trees holds an AB and MA in Slavic languages and literatures from UC Berkeley. He wrote his undergraduate thesis, The Eschatological Climate in Dostoevsky, for Czeslaw Milosz, whom he worked for as a graduate student. He has translated Fedorov and Lev Shestov, all of the previously untranslated work, from Russian. He translated Milosz and Julian Ryevsky's memoirs The True Story of the Polish Conquest of the Enigma Machine from the Polish. And Boris Groys is professor of aesthetics, art history, and media theory at the Center for Art and Media Karlsruhe, and global distinguished professor at New York University. He's the author of many books, including The Total Art of Stalinism, Ilya Kabakov, The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment, Art Power, The Communist Postscript, and Going Public. Let's give a warm welcome to Stephen Van Trees.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brian. As said, I'm Steve Van Trees up from Washington, D.C. today. I want to thank Brian. I want to thank Professor Boris Groys. I want to thank Kay and Magdalena for bringing me up here. It's been, you know, as noted from my biography, it's probably been 30, 40 years since I was a Slavic graduate student. I think you can tell. So this is really the first time speaking in public to a group about the work I've done on Fedorov. And I think great. So this is the only known image of Nikolai Fedorov. He was notoriously averse to publicity, notoriously averse to publishing his works. He thought it better to publish them anonymously, that they would live by their merits rather than living by the so-called fame of his bestseller list. And so it's actually part of the story how we even have this picture. But what I'd like to do is start the talk with my imitation of Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Peterson, who is one of Fyodorov's sidekicks, brings Dostoevsky an account of Fyodorov's ideas. Dostoevsky publishes them in Diary of a Writer, and Dostoevsky comes back to Peterson and says, the first matter is a question. Who is this thinker whose thoughts you now sent me? If possible, let me know his real name. He aroused my interest more than enough. But let me tell you, essentially, I'm in complete agreement with his ideas. I have read them as if they were my own. Today I read them to Solovyov, our young philosopher who is now delivering lectures on religion. I now waited for him on purpose to read an account of your thinker's ideas. And so then Dostoevsky goes on. Does your thinker intend this to be taken directly and literally, the idea of physical resurrection, as religion implies, and that the resurrection will be real, that the abyss that divides us from the spirit of our ancestors will be vanquished by vanquished death, and that the dead will be resurrected, not only in our minds, not allegorically, but in fact, in person, actually in body. And this, again, is the nota bene from Dostoevsky. Not, of course, in their present bodies, for when immortality begins, marriage and the birth of children will end, and that alone is testimony that in the first resurrection, designated to be on earth, the bodies will perhaps be like Christ's body in the 50 days between his resurrection and ascension. An answer to this question is essential. Otherwise, it will be impossible to understand. I warn you here, that is, Solovyov and I, at least, believe in a real, literal, personal resurrection, and that one will come to pass on earth. And that, again, turn to the presentation. Who is this man? We're going to answer Dostoevsky's question, okay, and see how influential Fyodorov was on Brothers Karamazov. Okay, when I read Brothers Karamazov, it was clear to me I was hearing other voices from having read the earlier Dostoevsky. So Fyodorov's biography, which is actually pretty routine, his language, work, and ideas. I will do 1,500 pages of Russian philosophy in one slide. And so and then talk about his contemporaries, Dostoevsky, Solovyov, and Tolstoy. Talk about his philosophical heritage, some of the better-known Russian philosophers that followed Fedorov, and pick up his work. The fascinating part, as Brian mentioned, there's a strong materialist, technological aspect to Fedorov. Okay, this is not as he accuses Dostoevsky that we're going to sit and wait for the big miracle and something's going to come across the abyss. This is actually quite specific in a number of realms. Brian mentioned spaceflight, but also agriculture, the meteorology, practical work, and then talk about his influence today, and then kind of a pitch for Fedorov in English, and talk about how I came to do a work that size. So I think the first point, really, I'm going to skip a little ahead, I'll let you read that, but the talk about Fedorov's biography. He was the illegitimate son of Prince Pavel Ivanovich Gagarin. So he was the son of Prince Gagarin. And when the prince died, he had to leave the household, was sent to local schools, still subsidized by the family, well educated. But then he really worked as a high school teacher across Russia. And you can kind of track when his major ideas come forward by how often he's getting fired from local provincial high schools. And he becomes acquainted with Peterson, who is a real Russian. Peterson gets his name, also an illegitimate child, gets his name from the Swedish maid of another Russian father. And the idea is Peterson is tied in with Tolstoy's Yasnaya Polyana community, and the idea is that Peterson recognizes Fedorov for what he is and becomes really kind of proselytizing for Fedorov. You ought to write this down, you ought to get it published, you ought to get it out. And in 1869, Fedorov started work as a librarian at the Romantsov Library in Moscow, and really spent the rest of his life as a librarian, noted to have read all of the books. If you asked for books, he would give you books and more besides. And the touching part, we read Dostoevsky's question. Fedorov and Peterson decide Fedorov really is going to write it up. Fedorov really is going to write out what he calls the philosophy of the common task. But he's busy winters. He's busy at the library. So he only takes off summers to write up his work of genius. And by the time he's taken enough summers to write it up, Dostoevsky is dead. And so it really, he distributes it locally, distributes it to Solovyov and Tolstoy. But there is really no publication of it at all in Russia, except for little magazine topical articles. Nothing of the great work until after his death. So this part of the challenge of a translation. I was talking to Professor Groys before the talk is not only understanding the Russian, and Fyodorov's Russian is hard enough. You know, he's hard enough in Russian, but really the things that are easier in Russian than in English. Okay, so that Fedorov starts out as an illegitimate child. His first concept is rebuilding his family, becoming part of his family, rebuilding the kin, rebuilding the people. And so he starts with the word rod, and all of those words in Russian are intimately related. They all look from a common root. And in English, we get them from all kinds of roots. You'd never guess that nature and kinship and people and homeland are all from the root, meaning the genus or kin. And so the idea is that Fedorov has a strong linguistic edge to him, where he studies the origin of language and he works on how that's separated as the tribes, if you will, became spread across the earth. And he likes to trace back where that language came from. Again, the Voskresenia, his word for resurrecting, he is very specific that he does not like the standard word voskresение, the Tolstoy's resurrection, because it's a perfective verb. It's just like that, something happens. You know, big magic happens right before the project's due. And Fedorov is not like that. Fedorov is very much, we're going to go out every day and we're going to work on this and we're going to figure out what we're doing. But it's very much, everyone participates. It's very much a common task. So it's an imperfective verb. And then the two that he uses a lot and that are just tricky to catch in English, he talks about ojivlenie, which is enlivenment, but how do you really capture that in English, right? So you can talk about animation, right, which would be fine for when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, but it's not, you know, it's not fine for today. People think of Walt Disney or something. There's no good word for restoring life to someone that's as pithy as the Russian. That's a word. That's a Russian word. It's not a little phrase with a footnote. And then odushevlenie, ensoulment, restoring the soul. I mean, in the references, there's a dissertation by Zadokalsky, and his whole theme is, okay, let's say we believe what Fedorov is doing. Let's say we believe that, as Brian and I talked, the atoms, if you will, can recognize each other and they will reconstitute. And Zadokalsky spends a dissertation on, well, what does that mean then as far as how do you restore consciousness once you restore the body? Wonderful, wonderful stuff, you know. But again, just catching this as we start. And so and again, talk about Fedorov's ideas. You know, we had talked about, we want to leave time for the Cosmos and his followers. So I'll do. This is really a 1,500-page translation in a couple of bullets. And so he talks about, as we said, the meaning of the family, the rod. He talks about the common task, and if you read closely through any of the other Russians, through Solovyov or Bulgakov, the task, the dela, becomes a key word, becomes a word that you say, okay, they're talking about picking up where Fedorov left off. And it's a real simple task. It's the resuscitation, the resurrecting of every generation that ever lived, you know, and the sons regenerate the fathers regenerate their fathers, and it becomes exponentially simpler because you got fewer fathers the more you go up the tree. So and he looks at that from two aspects. Okay, so the one is the transhumanism as you hear it today, the idea that man has certainly evolved from the earliest, and Fedorov's picture of that is, for example, the son grieving the lost father, and he looks at the sky, and what does that mean? That means he needs to stand up, okay? That means he needs the prehensile hands, that means his forehead needs to adapt as he looks to the sky, okay? And Brian, you know, headed right in, you know, it just, you look at the sky, and we'll see in the presentation how important that is, and again, what you've got then is man evolving, but again, what Fedorov speaks to now is we are trapped in a world where nature is a blind force. He loves the blind force, and what that does is just destroy us, but in Fedorov's terms, it's more like a wild horse, that if we turn it into something directed by reason, then it's entirely different, okay? So it goes all the way from agriculture. He has this, he starts off his major work, not with let's talk about the meaning of life, but you know, I was just reading about the Crimean War, and they were shooting cannons up in the air, and it changed the way it rained, and that's a good idea. You know, they're doing it in America too, you know. So Fedorov is kind of like your West Virginia grandfather. Is really, you know, he's kind of cranky, but he's got a lot of good stories and a lot of good anecdotes. And really, he speaks to the regulation of agriculture. He speaks to the regulation of the weather. You know, that you can, you know, cloud seeding, or, you know, the whole idea that a real naive positivism that, yeah, we can do that. Yeah, and he and we'll deal with it later with Tsiolkovsky, but the whole idea of flight, the whole idea that the stars are just uninhabited worlds. You know, it's just fascinating. And again, what is critical in Fedorov is then all of this is tied together. All of this is definitely multi-stage. Is that you talk about this is tied to the Christian task. Okay, so certainly he didn't think of resurrection by himself. He, especially this time of year, we're right on track for this talk. He loves the story of Lazarus. He just one of the things about Fedorov is it's a lot of it's an oral tradition. You can just see Peterson trailing along behind him, you know, just writing it down. So there's, but he talks about Easter as the prototype of the resurrection. Again, one of his favorites, one of the ones he's published a lot while he was alive, was the concept of the one-day church. A lot like our barn raising. You kind of get everybody, and you kind of put the pillar up there, and you kind of raise the barn one morning. And Fedorov just loves the one of his favorites. They've had this railroad, and the railroad's been upgraded. So they're taking railroad ties, they're taking modern technology, and they're just repurposing them for this church. And so that the other point is that this is a very totalistic, totalitarian kind of vision, in that everybody is on path, everybody's on the project, everybody has something to do. He's very clear about universal literacy, universal conscription. And we're gonna have the army, and we're not going to disband the army. They're going to turn into kind of a militia, and they're going to turn into kind of a natural science observers. You know, that we're going to have this web of weather stations, and it's going to be, you know, we won't need people to be killing our neighbors. You know, so they'll have to do something. So they'll do something socially useful with the weather observation, so that and again, very much you have the Tsar at the top. It's very much a top-down vision. So again, he talks about the meaning of the village versus the city. I mean, one of the fascinating things about reading Fedorov is at one point you're reading kind of pagan visionary of I saw an airplane, no one's ever seen one, we're going to make them. On one hand. And then on the other hand, he's talking about, I don't care for Nietzsche, I don't care for Marx, I don't care for any of these guys that you know of from modern texts. And so he's very much, sometimes he's a grumpy pagan, and sometimes he's a detailed philosophical critic. It's a fascinating range. And what he talks about is the meaning of the village versus the city. And really the city, you know, has been damned since the book of Genesis. You know, ever since Cain and Abel went off, and, you know, Abel was the farmer, Abel stayed in the village, Abel's okay, you know, and Cain's the killer, Cain went off, and Cain can't stay in agriculture because the Lord said, so he went off and founded the city, you know, and the city is nothing but misdirected technology, the city is nothing but, you know, everybody's all painted up and having a good time, and it's just nothing like Fedorov needs, and it's a bitter kind of, you know, all the prodigal sons in one place kind of thing. And then I know how I was brought into this. Kay was nice enough. She had talked to George Young, who had written a major book on Fedorov, and then a major book on the Cosmos. And I had shown him the translation, and he was, I think, amazed, one, that anyone had finished it, but you know, the point was he connected us through the concept of the museum. What does the museum mean for Fedorov? So I'd like to take one of my old Berkeley professors, Irene Mossing-Delic, wrote a very good book called Abolishing Death, which is in the references. But she speaks specifically to what is the Fedorovian Museum, okay? And it's the memory of the dead is scientifically preserved and piously celebrated in the cathedral contained therein. It is an institution that not only preserves the relics of the dead as exhibits, but also attempts to revive them through scientific research. The proper museum restructures the traditional cemetery into a complex of laboratories for applied research, cathedrals where active liturgies are celebrated, artistic studios where ideal human forms are created, portrait galleries where the dead are iconically preserved, data collecting libraries, architectural excavation sites, and so forth. And the common goal is the preserving and restoring the dead. And so this, again, and scientific preservation goes hand in hand with artistic restructuring. So this is the key connectivity with bringing Fedorov into this, bringing us up here. And so the other fascinating part, we'll reflect on it again, but is the conditionality of the prophecy. A lot of times when you read apocalyptic religions, when you read you know, the eschatological visions, there always has to be the world is going to go to hell, we're going to live in this realm of evil, and everything is going to go to hell in a handbasket, and only then are we going to have the ends of days. And you know, there's a famous anecdote where Berdyaev and Shestov are walking down the street in Paris, and Berdyaev, it's just before World War II, and Berdyaev says, "It's all going to hell. It's just terrible. What are we going to do?" And Shestov says, "That's great. That's just what I say in my philosophy." You know, and that's the point. Is that doesn't help. You know, that what Fedorov explicitly says, and it's a simple idea, but it's great, is that all of that stuff in Revelation is conditional. All it says is that if mankind does not get its act together and execute the common task, then we have the terrible judgment. Then we have the end of days. But there is certainly plenty of time to execute the common task and avoid all of that. It's a wonderful direct reading. So that's Fedorov on one slide. And then again, really like to talk about what's key in Fedorov's contemporaries. You know, there's a good book. It's there's a good book by Robert Lord that has an article on Fedorov's influence on the brothers Karamazov, and certainly we can see the things with the broken families. We can see the whole theme of collective responsibility. The whole theme of each of us is responsible for everyone else's action. And in fact, Miłosz points out in kind of a snide remark that the end of Karamazov, where Kolya Krasotkin and the kids are in this little Boy Scout troop, is kind of Fedorovian. But you know, the whole point was there's if you let me read from my translation, there's a section called Supramoralism, which is what Fedorov calls one of his pieces, and he talks about why Dostoevsky, Solovyov, and Tolstoy don't measure up, and what he says is in Dostoevsky's letter it said that resurrection will occur on earth, but just this will occur shows that per Dostoevsky's thought, that resurrection kind of happens all by itself, that it's not a task of the human race. And meanwhile, in the same letter, resurrection is called a duty. And so how can Dostoevsky acknowledge resurrection as a duty? We are not told. And what are we supposed to do for fulfillment of the task? And so Fedorov is very, very literal. You know, he's read Crime and Punishment. He talks about, you know, in the next, you know, clearly Raskolnikov is lost to God, but Dostoevsky offers no positive solution. You know, that whole, the epilogue to Crime and Punishment, which nobody likes except, you know, Rodya is clutching Sonia through the flimsy burnous. You know, it's just, he wants something much more. You know, they went off and they did something positive to execute the common task. And what Fedorov says is Raskolnikovs could not exist if the duty of resurrection were acknowledged. And so it's a very polemic kind of attitude. And the you know, and finally, you know, it's too detailed to read, but when Fedorov really gets going, it is just fascinating, the level of polemic, and he gets to yelling at Dostoevsky. And I had this sentence, and it was in Russian, it was just absolutely incomprehensible. You know, it was just screaming about history and Jerusalem and Paris and everything else. And I brought it to Russians. I brought it to educated Russians, and they said, well, you shouldn't have picked Fedorov, is what they said. But the idea was that what I had to do was go, okay, he's clearly taking Dostoevsky for one of his characters. Fair enough. Who's the character in Dostoevsky who much loves the, you know, the faded glory of Paris and all that kind? So you have to do this kind of Dostoevsky crossword to even translate the sentence. And of course, it's Versilov in The Adolescent, and then so you have to reread that, and then I found the sentence. Okay, and I was just so pleased. And so the translation is really, that line took me several weeks of spare time. I mean, rereading Dostoevsky's no penalty, you know, but it was just fascinating, the level of detail and how much he's really tied in. And so let's talk a minute about Solovyov. Solovyov is obviously much younger. Solovyov, I'm sure you all know, is clearly tied in as a major influence on Karamazov, and so we know that. But really the key is that Solovyov is likewise very taken with the whole idea of the physical resurrection. And so that but again, he looks, it's not a lecture on Solovyov, but Solovyov looks at how this is going to occur, how man is going to transform. He looks at that differently. He speaks about androgyny. He speaks about the change in the whole marriage relation, all these aspects in a different way than does Fedorov. And, you know, Solovyov is much wider. There's the whole eternal feminine, the whole Sophia, all of that is not seen at all in Fedorov. And so, and again, the one quick reading about from Solovyov, he talks about, I will say only, that since the time of the appearance of Christianity, your project is the first forward movement of the human spirit along the way of Christ. For my part, I can only recognize you as my teacher and spiritual father. And the saddest thing about Solovyov is the way he generally loses faith in his own vision toward the end of his life. He writes, you know, 3 Conversations. He writes about the Antichrist. He writes about the failure of his utopian vision. You know, just can't finish the race. And in fact, in his last work, short story, The Antichrist, George Young's book points out real well the Solovyov parodies Fedorov, that this man of genius, semi-Asiatic and semi-European, who marvelously combined a mastery of the most recent discoveries and technologies of Western science with a knowledge both practical and theoretical of all major tendencies in the traditional mysticism of the East. The results of this combination were amazing, Apollonius, for instance, had perfected the half scientific and half magical art of producing atmospheric electricity at will, so it was said that he commanded fire down from heaven. So it's the whole Solovyov's, putting the digs in as the dream fades, and so it's, but it's true he was key. And then what's fascinating about Tolstoy, and I won't spend a lot of time on Tolstoy. You can tell which kind of Russian tradition I come from, but you read Western literature about Tolstoy, and everybody loves Tolstoy, and just Fyodorov, Tolstoy really loved Fyodorov. It was the idea that Tolstoy, if I were not a Tolstoyan, I'd be a Fyodorovian kind of thing. But, Fyodorov's going, you used to write great novels, but now you're just an idiot, and just this whole idea that, I'll read from my translation again. Tolstoy does not acknowledge logic. He is above it. Not acknowledging logic, Tolstoy does not believe in miracle either. What does he acknowledge? Tolstoy acknowledges only himself, his own I. He is higher than the law, higher than everything. And Tolstoy wishes to convince everyone that reality is the exact opposite of what it is. And the whole, it really drives Fyodorov crazy, where Tolstoy is vilifying the icons, Tolstoy is vilifying the church, and Tolstoy is, speaking for nonviolence and non-doing, and just kind of laying down before the evil in the world. And it's not Fyodorov, and I don't have the citation for it, but really, Tolstoy laying down leads a large part of the nobility to be speaking of nonviolence right at the first Russian Revolution, and really makes it easy for that revolution to occur. It really paves the way for them, so that this is Fyodorov among the key contemporaries, and he said modestly, you can't understand any of the three without knowing how Nikolai Fedorov came through. So again, this is the measure of Fyodorov's popularity. I couldn't find this on the World Wide Web, so it must not exist. The idea was that, as we said, he was violently opposed to his image being taken on the idea that being taken as an idol and such, so that Leonid Pasternak, Boris's father, noted artist, is somewhere back in the stacks. He's somewhere front row center here, and drew this picture. And there's Fyodorov, and there's Solovyov top center, and there's Tolstoy bottom left. So I got that. I scanned that off Lukashevich's book, which is a marvelous, systematic laying out of Fyodorov, out of print. I have a copy if you want to borrow it, but it really is a measure of, there's one picture, and so so again, I'd like to, Brian asked me, for that part of the presentation, and I thought that was really interesting for something you thought you knew about Russian literature that becomes new. This, I hope, will be newer, and really talk about his Fyodorov's philosophical heritage. Okay, how did he influence? As you see, these gentlemen are all one generation younger. These all born in the late 19th century. How did he influence each of those? And that's Bulgakov, that's Berdyaev, and that's Shestov there. And the Bulgakov first has a marvelous career. He starts as a committed intellectual Marxist, writes a book called Philosophy of Economy, and again, to take Jung's description, like Fyodorov, Bulgakov sees present nature as material necessity, a force of disintegration and death, and the human task is to take ownership, free life from material necessity, and overcome nature and death. The struggle against the antagonistic forces of nature for the purposes of defending, affirming, and broadening life, with the aim of conquering and taming these forces, becoming their master or proprietor, is in fact what, in the broadest and most preliminary sense, we call economy, or хозяйство being the Russian term for everything involved with management. And the again, he doesn't as we'll see in the next set of slides, he doesn't develop the idea of the technological aspect, but the whole idea of how does man work toward miracle is pure Fedorov, and it's worked out more authoritatively by Bulgakov. Bulgakov becomes an Orthodox priest. He's on the famous steamship full of philosophers. So the Soviets decided these philosophers were of no use for the new regime, but they didn't want to kill them, so they put them all on a steamship and sent them west. It's a marvelous tale. He becomes an Orthodox priest, and my wife bought me a set of Russian philosophy and English books for Christmas. It was wonderful, and one was Bulgakov's on the Gospel Miracles, and he talks about Bulgakov. His spiritual action becomes a physical force, as it were, but only as it were. In essence, in both cases, we equally have the action of spirit upon the forces of nature. We have an action that directs or regulates. And then again Bulgakov, he's talking about miracles. He's saying, look, you make fun of Fedorov for doing agriculture, but we're only talking loaves and fishes done right. We're really talking pretty basic, and what he talks about is mankind has already started out on the path to such a conquest of nature. Finally, does the conquest of the forces of nature in the most general sense also not constitute a constant aspiration of mankind, which here is actualizing the Lord's command, subdue the earth? In other words, all the works of Christ can be directed at human skill as an example and summons, or as a project, to use Fedorov's terms. And so Bulgakov specifically talks about regulation of nature. He talks about the actualization of miracle, just developing in the theological sense what Fedorov brought forward. So then like to turn to Berdyaev, who is, I don't know if it's an oxymoron, he's probably the best known Russian philosopher. So there you are. He did a lot of his work in France after he emigrated. There's a lot of nice biography. Shestov goes into exile first and helps Berdyaev out, and he teaches at the Russian school in Paris, does a lot of work. But again, Jung's description, Berdyaev takes off from the people you know. Okay, he reworks Nietzsche for the idea of man's rebellion against God. He reworks Dostoevsky in terms of human freedom, and in terms of human creativity, he works Fedorov. Apparently, if you looked at Berdyaev's desk, there was portraits of each of those three on the desk. And again, Fedorov wrote a detailed article, 35 pages, that's been translated. You can click through on Wikipedia to that article, and it's a pretty literal translation, but stick with it because it's got an amazing kind of explication of Fedorov's ideas, but also kind of arguing with them. It's not this is Fedorov and everything's just what we would think. So that Berdyaev's, this is again is Jung, Berdyaev's chief criticism of Fedorov is the common task of resurrecting the dead seems much more like restoring the past than it does than creating the future. It seems much more in the traditional museum sense, recreating detail for detail exactly what was, instead of creating a new humanity and a new world. And so it's this fascinating interplay of things Fedorov put out there, and then people add to the project. That may perhaps be exactly what comes through in the translation, and then Berdyaev picks up that no, it's got to be more than that. And the again, to look at some of the Berdyaev article, you know, he talks about, we've seen this, the exceptional and unprecedented awareness of the active vocation of man in the world in his religious demand of an active, regulative, transformative relation to nature. Okay, so getting away from the old religious duality that we're waiting for some better world afterwards, and so he revolts against the passivity. And again, Berdyaev specifically focuses on nature being our temporal enemy but our eternal friend, that we have to regulate nature. And then I'd like to one deep read from Fedorov, from Berdyaev, because I think he exactly gets right the talk about the conditionality of the judgment. Okay, so the dread last judgment is only a threat for the immaturity of mankind. Death is also an expression of immaturity, of a lack of self-sufficiency, of the incapacity to destroy life. For the mature, resurrection ought to become imminent, i.e. resuscitation. Okay, if mankind were to unite itself for the common task and set about to active resuscitation, then it would avert the end of the world and the dread last judgment, and then immediately pass over into eternal life. And then eternal life is not, you know, not to make fun of Catholics, which I am, but there's this passage in St. Augustine where part of the bliss of the saved, right, is as the saved go across the bridge wherever they're going, they get to observe the torture of the damned who didn't go to church. And Fedorov is exactly the opposite of that. Okay, we're all going or nobody's going. So there isn't this, the elect pass over and everybody else is left. And so it's a marvelous kind of thing. So that's Berdyaev, who lives past World War II. And then Shestov, again, was when I was in graduate school, was one of Professor Miłosz's absolute favorites. He was one that really spoke to Miłosz, being in the Polish occupation, then coming to the U.S. But the idea, Shestov's idea, is really diametrically different from Fedorov's. It really speaks to the limitations of human reason, the limitations of human language, the limitations of all great systems, and that really you're only going to find salvation in faith beyond that, okay, beyond, and Shestov's early critique of Tolstoy, he goes, we've got to find what is beyond the good. We've got to find God. And I've also, Shestov had a number of books that were translated into English in the 1920s. D.H. Lawrence, the D.H. Lawrence, along with the Russian sidekick, actually put those across. And then in the 60s, there was another wave where a relative of Shestov's, Bernard Roberts, who read French, translated some of Shestov's work from the French. And then I went back, and I've got all of the previously untranslated Shestov done. Okay, so that it's a smaller set. It's about 1,000 pages, but again, it's just well worth reading and a pleasure to translate. I mean, Shestov is like running as opposed to going on hands and knees through Fedorov. Fedorov, you can take a sentence and time well spent getting it out. But in something his daughters published after he was dead, Shestov has a very small article about Fedorov, and mostly it's historical, but he does speak to Fedorov's doctrine of knowledge, that the principle of Hellenism is reduced to the principle, know thyself, which Fedorov explains in the sense that one must know, think only of oneself. So Fedorov sees false doctrine in all of the other religions, all the ones that are just self-contemplation, all the ones that Fedorov is really, you know, faith without works is dead. That's the whole key. And so that ends the philosophical part of the presentation. So now, there we go. So one anecdote. So Fedorov, this is Tsiolkovsky, Vernadsky, and Bogdanov, right to left. So the anecdote goes, and again, this is Victor Shklovsky, who loves making up the anecdotes. But the idea is there's this deaf kid from the provinces. He's had scarlet fever. He can't hear. And so their idea of an individualized instruction plan at that point is to kick him out of school and go to the city and go to the library. Maybe somebody will talk to you. So he goes to the library, and who should be there but the librarian? Okay, so Fedorov's behind the desk, and this kid comes in. And kid wants to learn geometry. So Fedorov tutors him in geometry. Fedorov gives him other useful works to do. And so the kid comes back to Fedorov and goes, what's the point of all of this? Why are we working on this? Why do I have to do math, Dad? And Fedorov says, look, my project is the physical resurrection of every man, woman, and child that ever lived. Kid looks up at him and goes, shit, boss, where are we going to put him? And Fedorov says, look, you're deaf, so I'm going to pre-brief, but we're going to go up on the roof. We're going to go up on the parapet. We're going to stand on the roof. We're going to look at the stars. And the stars are the uninhabited Earths. And that's where we're going to put the resurrected generations. And the deaf kid, was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Okay, and Tsiolkovsky went from being the deaf kid in the Romantsev library to being the father of the Soviet space program. Okay, he designed, built, test-fired multi-stage rockets. You know, did the whole engine cooling, did the whole atmospheric flight, did all of that from first principles. Okay, and the whole idea is there's a documented, direct connection with Fedorov, you know, and you read present day, you know. I read a satellite communications book a couple weeks ago, and they think they're being cool when they go back to Tsiolkovsky. They go, it all starts with Tsiolkovsky. And I go, no, it doesn't, you know. And somebody had to teach Tsiolkovsky plane geometry, you know, and that was our buddy. And so the other key thing at this point, if you look at Soviet space flight, who was the first cosmonaut in orbit? Who was the first man in space? Yuri Gagarin. Who's Gagarin? Gagarin is Fedorov's father. Okay, so Fedorov's going on about we're going to send the fathers into the atmosphere. You know, I'm just saying. So and so the Tsiolkovsky himself, and we'll see it a little later, is also has also very dramatic ideas of resuscitation and revivification, and those are we'll see those in a minute. But it's just a huge believing is seeing. Okay, Fedorov's got the vision, and all I needed was an engineer to put them rockets out there. Okay, so that's absolutely key. Okay, so the next one is Vladimir Vernadsky, and again, my wife gave me a big bag of books, and one of them was The Biosphere by Vernadsky for Christmas. It was just a super Christmas. And Vernadsky, again, biochemist, geochemist, speaks to the biosphere, the noosphere, and really looks at the whole how does Earth affect the organism? How does the atmosphere affect the and really I have a special spot in my heart for translators, but really right at the beginning of the translation, they speak to the special positivist attitude of Vernadsky's translation, that we're talking how does science progress, and it's by investigation. It's not by guesses, it's not by conjectures, okay? It's we're actively walking through this as a task, okay? So that whole picture, and just a couple of spots from Vernadsky to talk about the biochemistry, the scientific later. See, this is pure Soviet era. He lived a long time, and speaking about a portion of the atoms of the unchangeable covering layer never leave this vital cycle. Life is parsimonious in its expenditure of absorbed matter and parts from it only with difficulty. Life does not easily relinquish the matter of life, and these atoms remain associated with life for long stretches of time. So the whole, you go from conservation of energy to conservation of matter, and if you can't find the matter, it's out there somewhere. It's just very, very fertile. Because of the law of economy, there can be atoms that have lived in the framework of living matter throughout whole geological periods, moving and migrating, but never returning to the source of inert matter. And it's just again, to look at one more from Vernadsky. Life remains unalterable in its essential traits throughout all geological times and changes only in form. All the vital films, plankton, bottom, and soil, and all the vital concentrations, littoral, like on the seashore, sargassic and freshwater, have always existed. Their mutual relations and the quantities of matter connected with them have changed from time to time, but these modifications could not have been large because the energy input from the sun has been constant or nearly so. Living matter is not an accidental creation. Solar energy is reflected in it as in all its terrestrial concentrations. Again, implementation follows vision. Okay, so this is the wonderful, wonderful work from Vernadsky. So I originally selected Bogdanov without enough study, because if you look at the Russian, the name Bogdanov being gift of God is the same etymologically as Fedorov. I thought he kind of took it in Fyodorov's honor. It turns out it's a revolutionary pseudonym that he took from his wife's patronymic. So it was another fascinating dead end in how Bogdanov got his name. But Bogdanov is one of the 22 original Bolsheviks. Okay, he was with Lenin when the social revolutionaries in that matrix formed the original party, and again heavily Fyodorovian in his aspects. He's a trained medical doctor. Okay, the idea that if you really want to go help the people, help the narod, why don't you do something useful? Mr. Tolstoy. No, why don't you do something useful? Get a medical degree. So he does that. And what he speaks to is he actually writes a book called Red Star, which is science fiction, speaking about the restructuring of human society. A lot in common with the museum idea. You'll see the museum idea, and he also writes a major work on techtology, which is his form of systems organization. Again, the conscious implementation of Fyodorov's common task. And he dies young, as you see. He was doing blood transfusions on himself without fully understanding the science. But again, it was the cutting edge medical research and how do we extend life, and in this case, the revivification. But again, very much the themes. And so again, we have this strong aspect again of a whole different side of the Russian intellectual life, picking up on the technical implementation, not deepening philosophical or theological aspects, but really working forward there. And so the again, so this is the final, I think the final slide on influence, you know, really talking about, and I don't mean to make this a literary lecture, but talking about George Young, again, the one who connected me with e-flux, has a marvelous little point in his book, and he points to Irene Masing-Delik's book, and she actually does a whole influence of Fedorov on symbolist literature, that Andrei Bieley writes that all we were doing was really figuring out what Solovyov and Fedorov said. You know, everyone starts with the symbolist, but really it's deep influence from that one previous generation. So it's and again, Bloch's poem "The 12." If you look at Boris Pasternak, Leonid's boy, if you look at Dr. Zhivago, there's a big Fyodorovian character right in the middle there. I'm not going to argue one way or the other what Boris Pasternak thought, but there is a big, gracious kind of portrayal there of Fyodorov's ideas, and really it becomes a part of the present, so that the so again the want to talk one point from George Young's work, which is really useful, that I didn't have time to develop, but he talks about the Eurasians, which were a group that really came out of Gumilov's work on the change in the Soviet Union, heavily influenced by Fyodorov, and what they wanted to do was merge Marx and Fyodorov, the idea that Marx was the prototype for the 20th century and Fyodorov was the type for the 21st. And this traces through Vernadsky's idea, and again, this is Young. This is not something I've developed, but the whole idea is in recent times, Gumilov's theories come from Fyodorov, have proved especially useful to Russian neo-nationalists, neo-Eurasianists, and other with an anti-Western, anti-Atlanticist political bias. Most prominent of them, Alexander Dugin, who Vladimir Putin reads. So that whole trace has come full forward. And I'm not claiming that Eurasianism is a faithful representation of Fyodorov or Vernadsky, but it certainly falls close to that tree. It's certainly something that traces through Fyodorov, and so that then finally I found one real interesting article, and I've of course read Professor Boris Groys' work, and just masterful on this topic of what happened with the Soviet Union, what happened in that time, and Schlappentalk's article, and he's worked with Masing-Delik. It's full of good details, but it says this first. This is Schlappentalk. The authoritarian technocratic reading of Fyodorov was not only possible, but one of the most appropriate ones. And in this sense, it was not surprising that the Soviet regime, especially in its Stalinist period, provided the most fertile socio-political setting for Fyodorism. The Soviet approach to Fyodorism, reminding us that it is deadly serious about imposing on all society their utopian, rational, harmonistic order, which they perceive to be grounded in scientific truth. And so it's a fascinating, coffee shop topic about how, everything always ends up as 1984. We always start off with the best of intentions, and then we end up with this anti-utopia. But it's a fascinating trace, and again, look at again. I just can't resist going back to Tsiolkovsky, so that this is Schlappentalk picking up on something that Tsiolkovsky's thinking on immortality is somewhat different. He assumed that mankind was already immortal, According to Tsiolkovsky, the atoms, which were the building blocks of human consciousness, were immortal. So the death of an individual meant not a destruction of these animate particles, but their fall into a sort of hibernation. In the course of cosmic development, they would find themselves in the mind of some other animate creature. The crux of this problem was that these creatures, Tsiolkovsky believed that life was widespread throughout the universe, could not be a thinking being who, in his view, could enjoy a perfect life, but an inferior being. So this is just extremely detailed, extremely interesting, and again, not a topic tonight, but you know, you look at the other literary trace of all of this, the extent to which Tsiolkovsky also read Jules Verne, the idea that you see the idea of spaceflight, and then you know what you're looking for. So that the oh, there it goes. So the one last point, one last tie, and this again is from Schlappentock's article, and something I had also thought of myself. The 32 years ago this week, I think last Monday, President Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. We were going to have Star Wars, and this is Schlappentock talking about Gorbachev. And so he says, from this perspective, the early Gorbachev ideology was planetarian and cosmic in its universalist approach, and thus the cosmic globalist component of Feodorism was essential. In this context, the official Soviet press fulminated against the Reagan administration, which instead of joining the USSR in its effort to unite the world in a free collectivity of nations concerned with humanity's future, was actually planning humanity's extinction with its promotion of Star Wars. And Brian and I were talking about this at coffee beforehand, okay, that Gorbachev is a Fedorovian. Gorbachev believes that you can build a satellite system. If Gorbachev believes you can build a satellite system, he then believes the U.S. can build an attack satellite system, that we can build a countermeasure to that. If he believes that out of his Fedorovian Prometheism, he must believe that he must fund that because we're coming. Okay, so there weren't any doubts like there were on this side whether that vision was technically impossible, because we're Russians, we don't have doubts like that. So that they had to fund as though Star Wars were coming. And that led to the end of the Cold War. That led to the whole bankruptcy, because they had to react to the defense idea. So that the so let me talk a little about the translations. We're down to the last slides, and let me tell you one more Russian philosophy anecdote. So as Brian says kindly, I was once a Russian philosophy graduate student, long time ago. All I have now is the beard, but the idea was that I hadn't done anything with it for years, and then my late wife died, and I was out having dinner. I was courting the woman who is now my wife. And we have that discussion you always have of, here's my house, my job, and my kids. Think you can do remarriage? And that didn't last long. And then it was, well, tell me something else. What do you do that's interesting? And I go, I'm a Russian philosophy translator. She goes, great. What have you done lately? I go, well, I haven't really done any lately. I haven't done any for 30 years. I mean, I had a job. I had to restructure my entire life. I got a job at the FAA. A long story. But I had just read Bernice Rosenthal's anthology on the occult in Russian literature. And it was full of Fedorov, and it was full of guys I remembered from school. And the idea was Fyodorov's key. I had not seen a presentation like this. And as I told Brian, the hard part about putting this together was you go, well, I got to stop somewhere. You know, it's just everything is another slide. And so I said to my wife, I'm going to be a Russian philosophy translator again. So I started with volume 2, which is the articles. And so they're kind of like potato chips. You know, you can do 5 pages of Russian and say you've done an article. And so I worked backwards into the major works. And then in, I guess it was 2006, my daughter was 12, and she tried to kill herself for the first time. Ended up in the local locked hospital, and spent a succession of the next 7 years in and out of jails and hospitals and residentials in Virginia, Maryland, Colorado, lot of places. And the deal with that is something would happen, right? We'd end up in an emergency room. And they'd say, okay, she's going to go back here. You're the dad. You just sit here for the next 8 hours till she calms down, okay? I go, this is great. I got a pile of Fedorov, and I got a blank piece of paper. And that's what I'd do. And so I was the best dad. You know, they'd go, sir, it'll be another 2 hours. They go, great. He's talking about the revelation. You just keep her. I'll stay right here. You know, and so that was the whole deal. You know, so I got this big old pile of Russian philosophy. You know, and she, you know, years went in. She still hadn't gotten better. So I ran out of the Fedorov I knew at the time. So then I did all of Shestov the same way. And there's nothing like that experience of, Shestov has a book about Shakespeare. And in it, he's talking about Cordelia going after King Lear. And there's nothing like being in an emergency room, waiting to find out what's happening to your daughter, and you're sitting there going, Shestov is speaking to me. It's just great. You know, so I ended up with this whole pile. And then my wife had to leave. You know, the whole, there was a deal where the whole level of my daughter's behavior got so it wasn't safe having other people in the house. And so I ended up sitting there all that winter and the next and just typing Russian philosophy. I'd go to work and I'd come home and I'd type up Russian philosophy. And, you know, kind of the tail to the story, you know, my daughter finished her last placement 2 years ago, and as of Friday hasn't had an incident at all in 2 years. And my wife came back last August, and I got old Fedorov done as a side effect. Just, Dad, you sit there. We'll get back to you about 2 a.m. And so it really, you know, sustained me in a way. It really gave me something to do, which was key. But that's how you get a 1,500-page translation done. Is you have a lot of enforced spare time where, you know, and it's just, you know, my daughter helped. She's more adept than I am. She helped me put the transitions together. She got to hear the presentation a couple times, and so it's a nice story. It's kind of another what Russian philosophy did for me. But the idea, if you look at the translation, I've got volume 1 and volume 2 done. Those were the ones that Fyodorov's disciples head out of Russia, you know, and the 1905 revolution breaks out, so they publish them in Manchuria. Great. And so I've got those. Volume 3 is something George Young pointed out to me on the website, the Russian website right there. So I've got that in process. I don't have as much enforced spare time, but the idea is it has key work. It's not as long as the other two. It has a key biographical sketch, which is very good, by Semyonova, which I do have done. I do have that written out. And then it has new material on Dostoevsky, Solovyov, and Tolstoy. So George pulled it into his book, and I have read it in Russian but not translated. And there's the website for the adept. And so the next oh, look at that. Look at that. There's Fedorov again. Okay, so the bibliography, I copied some of this off the web, but the Berdayev is a very good article. It's hard to read. It's a very close translation. The guy has really given it a battle, but it's a click-through. You can get to it just by clicking through the wiki. I don't know the second one. The Kohler book is very good. The two Young books are very good. The Fedorov, an introduction, and then the Russian Cosmists. And the Russian Cosmist is still in print, and you can, a lot of the early part of that book is an update of his 1979 book. So that's huge fun. The Zakadalsky thesis I have, and is really, as I say, an honest attempt to look at what physical resurrection might actually mean in a materialist sense. The Lukashevich book, the one from the picture, is just wonderful. It's another kind of Peterson kind of, Fedorov's all over the place, but if you have this 15 by 17 matrix, I can show you all of Fedorov's major propositions. It's like reading more Fedorov. It's a great book. And then one of my old professors, Irene Mossing-Delic, talks about abolishing death, the salvation myth. And a lot of that is a detailed, close reading about people like Zabolotsky. It's people that really took Fedorov seriously in the Soviet era. So it's a good read. So that's and again, Brian had asked me for comments on other translations. There's a total of about, what sustained me when I was doing the translation, I had gotten all the other translations in English of Fedorov, and I thought I had about 300 pages of stuff already in English. And so as I was getting to the end, I go, I only have about 400 pages to go. I must be able to catch the train from here on in. Turns out most of these guys translated the same 100 pages, so I got misled. But the idea is the E.D. Scanlon Zelnick is that old history. It's it's probably from the 70s. It's probably when I was in school. But it's the 3-volume History of Russian Philosophy, which is anthology selections. They have a section from Fedorov. It's unreliable. The Russian word for peace and the Russian word for world are now the same, but they weren't before the revolution, before they updated the orthography. And Fedorov makes a detailed point of, playing off on those meanings, and that translation just gets it wrong. It just goes, it just misses it, falls it all the way through. The Shemin is a Russian religious thought anthology, very short, but a brilliant translation, just right, right on top, right literal, gets the terms right, just very nice. The Honeycutt book, help me, what is man created for? What is man created for? Yeah, it's a book put out in England a couple years ago. It's out of print, but someone, not me, has scanned it in. So if you click through on Wikipedia, you'll find it. It is accurate as far as it goes, but it has a funny way of editing kind of pages at a time. It does here's a couple lines of Fedorov, and I'm following along in the Russian, and then it literally jumps a couple of pages, so it becomes more kind of, I don't know, inspired by Fedorov. It certainly isn't what I would call a translation. I tend to be ponderously literal, just because if he wrote it that way, he wanted it in English that way. He didn't want Steve running across the stage. So and then again, what I've got here is the Philosophy of the Common Task. I've got volume 1 and 2 complete, and e-flux has them. There have been people that read Russian looking at them, which is huge. I mean, it's the whole, if you will, translating Fedorov becomes kind of a Fedorovian project, right? You bring it forward and you say, look, this this is what I did, you know, and mostly because it was part of my background I really enjoyed. And again, you know, the story of sticking by my daughter, you know, you're in some, you know, so some of the translation, I grant you, looks like it was done at 3 in the morning in a mental hospital waiting room on a knee board, but it was. So there, you know. So that's the whole point. You know, he's a tremendously interesting philosopher. I would say he's key, and it was just a tremendous effort and pleasure to work it through. So I want to thank Brian for bringing me up here. It's the first time in 40 years I've done a Slavic lecture, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, Stephen, thank you very much. It was really fascinating, and your love to Fedorov, yeah, of course, moving. Maybe a small comment, and then I'll ask questions. I think you made it very much clear that the central point in Fedorov is a relationship, and also other Russian thinkers you described or quote or referred to. The central problem for them was a relationship between religious tradition and materialist world we are living in, so post-religious, secular world. Post-Nietzschean world, in a certain way, because for them Nietzsche was a turning point. So if we cease to believe in the Christian promise, if we know that it's all wrong, yeah, so to say, and that we will die forever, there is no soul, there is no resurrection, history has no goal, and future is a black hole. Yeah? So if you know that, what is your reaction to the Christianity? And in many ways, and I think that is why Fedorov became so popular in Russia, especially after the revolution, and especially through the work of people like Bogdanov, so radical Marxists. Because if you look at the Marxist reaction to Feuerbach, it is very similar to the reaction of Fedorov or Solovyov to Nietzsche. If you say God is dead, religion is wrong, an illusion, Marx says at that time, it is not only a wrong critique, it is also false understanding of religion itself. Because religion gives a certain promise, and this promise is answer to a certain desire. And you cannot suppress it. Yeah? So if you say that religion is wrong, then you have to say happiness is not possible, ideal society is not possible, harmony is not possible, a harmonious relationship between nature and man is not possible, so on and so on. But people always wanted it. And they always invested this desire into religion. And when desire disappears, when religion disappears, desire doesn't disappear. Desire remains. So what we have to do with that? We have to make communist revolution. Yeah? If we make the communist revolution, we fulfill the Christian promise through the means of secular politics and through the means of technological material transformation of the world. Now, obviously, Marx, for this or that reason, was not interested in the concept of immortality. That was not a point at that moment. I also would like to say that it was not a point because the Hegelian secularism was not so radical as Nietzschean. And something like a return to the past, something like an absolute spirit, absolute museum were still possible. So this kind of mortality and finality, finiteness of human existence were not experienced so radical at that time, but they began to be experienced in a very acute way, in a very desperate way at the end of the 19th century. So the answer of Fedorov and his followers was absolute Marxist. It was a repetition of the Marxist answers at the beginning of the middle of the 19th century to a new way for secularization and materialism, Nietzschean way. So if we don't believe in the Christian promise, and I think it is quite important to understand that Fedorov never ever believed into the Christian promise. He never ever believed in the church promise of ontological resurrection, of resurrection by a kind of transcendent power through the intervention of transcendent divine power. He didn't believe in that. Soloviev was hesitant. Some other people were also hesitant. Berdyaev was hesitant. But he was a real materialist. And so he developed this program of realizing church promise of immortality through creation of technological, let's say, of new use of technology. Use of technology, he believed that technology actually serves sexuality. That is what many people at the time believed, what Darwin believed, what Bergson believed, all the people he read at the time. So, sexuality and, let's say, next generation.
Right.
Yeah, next generation. Soloviev somehow, Soloviev too, actually, right. Very, very, very obviously. But Fedorov simply didn't like the concept of sexuality.
Absolutely.
And he completely disliked children and reproduction. So he was simply against this kind of development and this kind of practice. Why? Because it enslaves every generation. Yeah? Every generation works for the next generation. The next generation works for the next generation. And there is no return. There is no recompensation. There is no happiness. There is slavery, 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 slavery. So he believed that concept of sexuality is intimately connected to the concept of progress, and both are evil. They are not only wrong, they're simply evil. So, this production of always the next generation and development of progress, leading to the, or let's say orienting to the idea, make life of my own children happy, or things like that. He wanted to completely abolish that and to give to the previous generation that sacrifice the life, sacrifice the happiness. They actually were promised to get something back, to go into paradise, but now we know that never do it, yeah, it never happened. To do something good to them. So don't think about children. Let us begin to think about fathers. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah. Let us turn. Let us make a U-turn of technology. Yeah, let us use the technology in a way that technology goes back to the goal of conservation and restoration, like in the museum,
Right.
and not forward for production and reproduction. So that is a project. That is a project that in itself is, of course, interesting. Interesting because, as you said, it creates a possibility of a society where, as Fedorov says and his followers say, a radical egoism coincides with the state reason. So there is actually no conflict. The conflict between the individual and state, individual society, becomes structurally impossible. Because if my ultimate goal is survival, and infinite survival, potentially infinite survival, and the goal of the state I'm living in is also my and everybody else infinite survival, then my ultimate egoistic goal coincides with the goal of the society in general, the state in general. And now I establish a certain kind of harmony with society that is not possible even in a Foucauldian society, society of biopolitics as described by Foucault, because the society accepts the death of individual, nature of death of individual. Here the society doesn't accept it and recognize my desire infinite survival. So that is already good. Now the question is it realistic? That's an interesting question. And that is precisely a question I would direct to you. Today we have all this, biotechnologies, right. We have DNA
right.
analysis, and so on and so on. So is such a project only, let's say, Kantian regulative idea, right. or it is a real project that can be realistically understood as realistic and which fulfillment is basically possible,
right.
It's technically possible.
Right. So you're exactly right. In fact, in one of your books, you speak to the desire to make time stop. That you want to move back to boy, if I could only move to the past, if I could only set it straight. And what Berdayev says, that Fedorov is really an eternal childhood. He wants us all to be back at kind of, at better words, a Boy Scout troop kind of age. And we're all moving forward, and we're all doing great stuff. On the other hand, he, as you say, he really, with a biblical hatred, hates progress, hates the progressive, hates the city. So he wants respect for the older generation. But you're right. Especially in the major works, he does speak to a kind of cult of eternal youth that we reconstruct as they were at some ideal stage. The other thing you and I have discussed is Solovyov mentions this. He says, if you reconstruct everyone exactly as they were, you're going to bring back cannibalism and everything else. It's probably not a brilliant idea. What are the practical implications of that? But I would say that certainly Fedorov's vision of, we're going to inhabit the planets, and so we need space flight. So let's build space flight. We need regulation of agriculture, so let's do something like that. And certainly there are, even if you look at the Fedorov entries on the web today, a lot of them are not pure Fedorov. They get into transhumanism and everything else. And but again, powerful inspiration. And yeah, certainly a spiritual project with a deeply materialist idea.
Yeah, it's realizability is interesting. At least in an artistic project, actually, I was reminded of Fedorov in a relationship to Merzbau by Schwitters, because he also included as a Merzbau examples, the samples of his blood and sperm, and also body elements of his friends. Yeah, and so on. So it is also an attempt to create some kind of longevity for the biological material that can be then used. Of course, it begins already with the Egyptian civilization, all the pyramids. And I think he was very much influenced by that because, of course, materialism came earlier, spiritualism.
Right.
And Egyptian materialist concept of immortality precedes actually the Jewish and Christian one. But what we can say about today's society? So, is it possible for today's mankind to desire infinity or to desire immortality? So, do we live really in a society that can be mobilized by such an idea? Or maybe the Nietzschean form of secularization took to deep roots. And we not only don't believe in the possibility of immortality, we even no desire, have no desire for it. What do you think?
Well, that's what Fedorov would say. Everyone with their smartphones and gradually seeding their for example, they can't find directions anymore because they're used to always getting it off their smartphone. So it does change the genome based on the automation you use. So there are powerful converse Fedorovian messages in overuse of modern technology. And so I've followed that. And again, the question of if you're doing things like knee replacements, if you're doing things like skin grafts, which are specifically in Fedorov already, what is the quality of life for that? Nobody's going to be 30 forever, and then what kind of Fedorovian experience is that? As you say, he also wants to freeze time.
Yeah, he wants to freeze time. Yeah. In a certain way, it is also oldest aesthetic dream. It begins with going back in time, freezing time, going back in time.
Sure.
Is Faust and all this stuff. And so art is a good medium. Our friends here made a museum of immortality, as we know, in many other projects. So art is indeed a space, an institution, and a medium that fits very well into this kind of project of a reversal technology, technology that goes not towards the destruction of existing in the name of substitution by something new, but that, so to say, makes its turns, and goes back. And now I would open that to the audience, precisely.
There was a fleeting reference to androgyny and the eternal feminine. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure. So that's not what Fedorov works on. It is very much a key concept in Vladimir Solovyov, that he believes that he starts first. He's a very German philosopher, and he starts with the idea of Marguerite in Goethe's Faust, and so that the eternal feminine draws us on. It's really the motivation for all of human history. And Solovyov actually has a vision at the British Museum telling him to go to Egypt. He goes to Egypt and has another vision, which is the vision of Sophia, the eternal feminine. And he does a lot of work on developing the whole concept of that. But that is not something Fedorov speaks to at all. And then the key problem with all resurrection projects, right, is that you don't really want people back the way they are, right? You don't want them in this begetting cycle, this fussing and fighting cycle. So you want them in some eternal cycle. And what Solovyov speaks to is the idea of getting past the sexual relation and becoming more like each other. And so there's a strong androgyny element in Solovyov's work, but not in Fedorov. So, thank you.
Hello, I have a question to Boris. What is, in your opinion, relationship of Cosmism to Putin's Russia? Because in a way, it's a recreation of the fictitious past, and with figures like Dugin, who is kind of kidnapping this ideology for reactionary politics.
Well, I think that at the heart of this ideology is a vague idea that Russian culture or Eurasian culture has a certain promise that keeps itself faithful to a certain promise. But it is very vague here. I don't have a feeling that Putin really would be interested in a resurrection of the dead. In many ways, for many reasons. So somehow kind of vague reference, vague ideological reference. At the beginning of the Soviet period, this kind of reference was understood much more seriously. So people really created an institute for blood transfusion and many things. So it was really, they tried to put it on a real technological basis, but Putin's Russia, as it seems to me, it doesn't do it, it doesn't intend to do it.